Welcome. Today I will show you a game from the Atomic Chess World Championship Final. And this was played around a month ago between GrandLapin and RK50. So RK50 is also a GM in real life. And GrandLapin is as well one of the strongest atomic chess players in the world. So this game is the final game of their match. They played in total 10 games of 3+2. And in the final game, GrandLapin had to win in order to score a 5-5 because he was trailing by 5-4. So let's take a look at the game. GrandLapin is playing with the white pieces, which is of course a big advantage in atomic chess. So GrandLapin opened the game with knight f3. And we see knight f3, f6, which is of course aimed to prevent knight e5, knight g5. White plays e3. Now black has multiple options. I think one option that is sometimes played is e6, and RK goes for a different option, namely to play d5. GrandLapin plays knight d4, which also makes a ton of sense. So you now liberate the queen. So sometimes you threaten to go knight to e6, followed by queen g4, for instance. And GrandLapin plays bishop to g4, attacking the queen. And yeah, obviously that would also explode the king if you allowed black to take the queen. So after f3, bishop f5, black is now threatening to explode on e6. And instead of just taking the bishop, GrandLapin goes for knight to e6. So this is always a good technique in atomic chess to actually force your opponent to make the capture, because this wins you one move. So to illustrate it, if white were to capture right now on f5, then it would be black to move. But as he now goes knight to e6, not that you can't take on c2 because of knight d8. So now you force black to take on e6, and now it's the same position, but it's white to move. GrandLapin goes knight c3, intending knight b5, which is now prevented by RK, just playing a6. White goes knight to e4. So this is a bit more of an advanced concept here. Why does white go knight e4? Well, taking on e4 is a little bit problematic in some cases, and the main reason is that the white squares are weak and that you can grab space right now by going d4, d5. So you basically sacrifice a piece, but the value of a piece versus a pawn is not as different compared to normal chess. So normal chess, the value of a piece is much higher compared to a pawn, and in atomic the difference is not as high, and if you can grab a little bit of space on top, that might make up for the piece. So RK didn't take it, but went for e6, d4, and now c5. Yeah, white goes now for an exchange of minor pieces with knight d6, bishop takes d6, and now plays c4. So note that whenever one side goes queen a5 or queen a4, you can always protect it with b4 or b5. So RK decides to go for knight h6. So far it's a pretty decent game from both sides. White goes for g4, preventing knight f5. And now RK goes for an exchange of queens. So he has a little bit less space, and I think that's probably why he decided to exchange queens. I'm not sure if this is necessary at this point, so knight d7 would be probably a good alternative here. So as I said, you just go b4. Note that you don't have any entry squares on a3, so you have to go queen a4 to back up that move, queen a5, and now of course white is forced to take the queen. And now after b5, the game is very closed. And I think now it's pretty clear that white has some advantage. White is slightly ahead in terms of development, so you already have a pawn on g4 slightly ahead in terms of space. And of course white has two bishops, which also here, given that the two knights are not very active, is an advantage. Yeah, white now goes g5. White goes a4, intending to go a takes b at some point, and then maybe b5. But now black plays f takes g, trying to bring the knight back into the game either via f6 and then maybe g4 or e4, or maybe via e7 and then f5. But more likely f6. So actually that's also what happens in the game after e4, knight f6. Yeah, it's again white's turn, and white goes rook g1, threatening rook takes g7 with an explosion of knight and rook. So black has to defend against this by playing g6, and GrandLapin plays bishop to h6. So I think here it's pretty clear that white is better. The rook is restricted, you can't go rook f8. But yeah, so black is hanging in tough and fighting back. So it's quite nice actually what Aka played here, namely rook a7, bringing one more piece into the game. And after bishop h3, which now threatens bishop takes e6, he goes knight to h5. And now he has a very concrete idea with this. So I mean, black's pieces cannot be hit at the moment, so that's one of the advantages he has. And he now wants to go either knight g3 or knight f4 next. So while white is up in terms of development, I think black did a very good job with this rook a7, rook knight h5 to keep the game going, just because white cannot do so much now with this lead in development. So white finds one way to continue, and it's actually a very interesting and clever way, namely going f4, intending f5. So that's also what happens in the game. So knight g3 and now f5. So note that after a move like g takes, white could, for instance, just go rook a2, rook f2. That would be one idea. And black cannot go rook f8 because the bishop is on h6, and black can also not go rook f7 because bishop takes h6 is a problem. So therefore, after f5, Aka decided to go knight to f1, hitting the pawn on g2 on h2 with an explosion of bishop and rook. But GrandLapin now just gave up the material here, which makes a lot of sense because he gets some concrete attack against the king and will get back material this way. So he goes for f6, knight h2, and now just f7. Yeah, black goes for king to d8. And yeah, now I think maybe in this position GrandLapin made a slight mistake by going bishop g5 check. I'm not exactly sure what the goal of this move was. So the computer gives e takes d5 with the idea of castling and going d takes c. So this makes some decent sense to me. So I think e takes d5 is probably stronger than what was played in the game, which is the move bishop to g5 check. Yeah, Aka has to run, and now white goes for the materials, just goes f8, getting material back. And we have a situation in which white is 2 pawns down. But the question is, of course, who can strike first via the f file or c file. And yeah, I think now probably GrandLapin should have gone for rook c1. And the idea is that, I mean, whenever you go rook f7, you still have bishop f6, so there's not really any entrance for that rook. And the idea that white has is to go c takes d, and then maybe d takes c, or b takes c and then c takes d, something like this. And so one possible line could be like, for instance, now g5 takes, let's say, and d4. So that's just one line which is now given by the computer, and which will likely end in a draw, because now after takes, we have an endgame where the king is sufficiently far away from the pawns. So with these 2 pawns, you can never force the king to go on a square where you can get a check and then take the pawn with explosion of the king. So the king can run around these squares if the king is checked. and that's the only option for white to win, because otherwise the pawns are just going to run, so that would be a draw. So it's possible that GrandLapin saw some of that and didn't want to go for a draw here, and therefore played bishop to e7. Yeah, but now black just runs with g5, followed by eventually g4. I mean, knight d7 you can play at any time, because you want to protect the square on f8 in case rook f1 comes. Yeah, and I think now probably it's the last option to go for something like rook c1, and the game would peter out to a draw. Instead, GrandLapin decided to go b takes c, but now Aka has a very strong reply, b4, and now suddenly this pawn is running, and this pawn on top of the same, having the same benefits as the g pawn, also now hits the rook on a1, and yeah, so that's quite unpleasant. So actually now GrandLapin went for bishop d8. I would have expected c takes d at first, but the problem is that then you can go rook to c7 followed by rook c2. So that shows you why he played bishop d8. Yeah, quite interesting to prevent rook c7 as a counter to rook c1 and c takes d. But now the problem is simply that white wants to go rook c1 and c takes d, but this is too slow. So black just goes b3. And if you go c takes d, you're already running into b2, and so you're just too slow. So there's a final hustle from white, let's say. White goes rook f1, but now black just calmly avoids any potential confrontation on the f file and goes knight f6, threatening again b2, b1. If you take on f6, it's just rook f7, rook exchange, and then you queen and win. So therefore GrandLapin decided to go c takes d now, with the idea to go rook f3, rook c3, and yeah, Aka played b2 to prevent rook c1 check, and of course to threaten b1 queen. And now yeah, GrandLapin played rook f3, intending rook c3, and I think the most simplest solution here for black would be to just take on e4, and yeah, the game ends momentarily after b1 queen. But instead Aka went for style points here, finishing off the game with an under promotion. So of course you can't allow rook c3, and therefore you can't go b1 queen. But Aka went for b1 knight, very aesthetic finish to the game. I mean, it's also just winning for black, and yeah, now the next move is knight c3. And yeah, there is nothing white can do. White played rook b3 in the game, and now after knight c3, white resigned in view of, let's say, king e1, knight takes a4, and you run out of material, and eventually one of these pawns is going to queen, and black is going to win. Well, this was a very interesting and complicated game. I think Aka showed what you have to do in Atomic to win games with black against very strong players. And this is to be really tenacious in defense. So I think he found some very nice motives with this rook a7, knight h5, knight g3 idea. And then at some point, either GrandLapin didn't want to draw or he didn't see it, I don't know. But in any case, black managed to come up with this strong passed pawn on the g file. And finally, white conceded the passed pawn on the b file, which then decided the day. Well, congratulations to Aka50 for winning the Atomic World Championship 2020, and see you next time.
When you have stress, play chess. When you fall on your ass, play chess for a real deal, for Christian C.